The boat was tied off just after sunrise. No sign of the man who took it out, only water pooling in the bottom, and a trail of muddy footprints that started in the boat, but led nowhere. It happened 4 years ago, and I still do not sleep well when the wind shifts through the cypress trees at night. My Uncle Paul was a seasoned fisherman, born and raised in the Louisiana Bayou. He knew those winding swamp paths better than anyone, had traps and trot lines scattered through murky waters most would be too afraid to wade into. He went out every other morning in his old wooden pirogue, whistling as he pushed off into the fog. The morning he disappeared, the water was especially still. That strange kind of quiet, where the usual insect buzz and frog calls seemed to hold their breath. I was staying with my aunt for the week, helping her with some repairs around the place. Uncle Paul had gone out just before dawn like always, telling us he would be back by lunch. But noon came and went. Then 2 p.m., then sunset. No sign of him. We called the sheriff around 7. The sun had dipped behind the moss-draped trees, and the swamp looked darker than usual, like something was hiding in it. They launched a quick search that night, but told us not to expect much until morning. Could be his motor died, or maybe he set up camp on a bank somewhere, they said. But Paul never camped. He hated staying overnight in the swamp, said the night creatures out there were older than men. He always said it like a joke, but I had seen the way he avoided looking into the trees after dark. The next morning, just after sunrise, I walked down to the dock behind the house to clear my head. That was when I saw it. Uncle Paul's pirogue, tied up like someone had just returned. But there was no sign of Paul. The boat was half full of muddy water and smelled like rotting fish. His tackle box was open, some lines still hanging into the water, and one of the oars was splintered down the middle. But what made my stomach twist were the footprints, bare, muddy footprints, starting inside the boat and stepping onto the dock. I followed them, heart pounding. They led 6 steps forward, then stopped. No drag marks, no prints returning, no disturbance in the tall grass, just 6 clear, wet footprints on the dock, and then nothing. It was as if whoever stepped out of that boat had simply vanished into thin air. Sheriff Del Rey came by an hour later, took photos, and scratched his head the whole time. "These are fresh," he muttered. "Real fresh, but there's no trail." They launched another search party that day, combed every inch of that area. Helicopters flew overhead, dogs were brought in, but nothing. No scent, no clothes, no remains. The only thing they found was Paul's lantern, deep in the cypress brush, resting at the base of a tree with scratch marks gouged into the bark above it. The scratches were deep, almost like claw marks, but spaced wide apart, too wide for any known animal. That night, I could not sleep. I kept hearing water sloshing beneath the dock. At one point around 3 a.m, I swore I heard a single knock on the back screen door. When I got up the next morning, there was a small pile of wet black moss on the porch mat. We tried to move on eventually. My aunt moved out the following spring, but I stayed in touch with a few of the older folks from that area, people who had lived along that swamp for generations. One man, Emil, said something that still sticks with me. He told me, "There is something in them waters that knows when someone ain't scared of it no more. That kind, it do not like being challenged." I asked what he meant. He just looked at me with glassy eyes and said, "Your uncle knew too much of the swamp. And sometimes the swamp takes back." But it was not over. 3 weeks after the disappearance, I received a letter. No return address. Just my name, written in shaky handwriting. Inside was a single photograph. It was a blurry shot taken from the tree line, looking toward the dock behind the house. It was early morning, by the look of it, fog curling off the water. And there, standing by the pirogue, was a figure, barefoot, covered in mud, face hidden in the mist. The photo was dated the morning the boat came back. I tried to trace it, to find out who sent it, but no one claimed it. The sheriff said it was probably a prank, but I could feel it in my bones. It was real. Someone or something had returned with that boat. And maybe it was not Paul, or maybe it was something wearing his shape. Last year, a new family moved into the old house. A young couple, city folks trying to live the quiet life. A few months after they moved in, I got a call from the husband. He had found my number on an old envelope in the shed. He asked me something that made my blood run cold. Do you know why there are wet footprints on the dock every morning, even though no one uses the boat? I told him to leave. I told him to burn that dock and never turn his back on the water. He laughed, thought I was crazy, but I have not heard from him since. They say sound travels differently in the swamp. I used to laugh at that until I heard someone screaming under my kayak, and the water refused to let me leave. I have always preferred being alone in nature. Most of my friends consider swamps eerie or disgusting, but for me, the bayou has always felt alive in a different way, teeming with secrets, like it remembers things the rest of the world has forgotten. I do not consider myself superstitious, but that changed last summer. I had driven out from Baton Rouge to a lesser-known stretch of marshland deep in the Atchafalaya Basin. I had found it on an old kayaking forum, nothing official, just a local as-tip about a quiet loop that winds through some of the less trafficked channels. A narrow inlet, dense tree cover, barely charted on GPS. Exactly what I was looking for. I arrived early in the morning. The sun was just starting to cut through the fog, and the air was thick with that wet, earthy smell only a swamp can give off. I launched my kayak from a soft, muddy bank and slowly pushed off into the water, leaving my truck behind in the small clearing. The water was glassy and black, almost too still. Cypress trees rose around me like crooked spires, and thick curtains of Spanish moss draped across the limbs, brushing the surface. Birdsong echoed faintly overhead, and the occasional splash from a turtle or frog broke the silence. For the first hour, I drifted peacefully. I was alone. No boats, no people, not even distant road noise. It was exactly what I came for. But things began to change when I passed through a narrow break between two trees, too narrow to be part of any official waterway. I only noticed it because there were fresh scratches in the bark, like something had forced its way through recently. I do not know why I followed it. Curiosity, I guess. Almost immediately, the air felt different, heavy, still. The usual buzzing of insects disappeared. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and slow, and every splash of my paddle echoed too loud, like the sound had nowhere to go. Then I heard it. It started as a faint wail so quiet, I almost mistook it for wind. But there was no wind. The water was still, and the trees did not move. I stopped paddling and held my breath. The sound came again. A scream, long, drawn out, distant, but unmistakably human. It was not an animal. It was not the wind. It sounded like someone underwater. I sat frozen. My kayak drifted slowly, turning with the faintest ripple. The scream faded. I should have turned around. But part of me told myself I imagined it, that isolation was playing tricks on me. So I paddled forward, slowly, cautiously. About 10 minutes later, I reached a wider part of the channel that opened into a circular basin, maybe 50 feet across. The trees here were older, thicker, and at the center was a massive, rotting cypress tree with exposed roots that looked like twisted limbs reaching up from the water. There was something hanging from its branches. Dozens of small dolls, some made of cloth, others carved from wood or bound with moss and string. Most of them were soaked and sagging. A few were charred. They swung slightly, though I felt no wind. That was when I heard the screaming again, closer this time. Then another voice, and another. They were coming from all directions beneath the water, like an entire crowd was down there, screaming up at me. I panicked. I yanked my paddle into the water and tried to backtrack, but the kayak did not move. It was like the water was holding me in place. No current. No resistance I could see, but the boat would not budge. Suddenly, I felt it. A bump from underneath, then another. Not fish. Not debris. These were solid, deliberate. Something was underneath me. I looked down, but the water was so dark, it was like looking into ink. Then came the voice. Gurgled. Wet. Impossible. It did not come from above the surface. It came from below, from the water itself. It whispered something I could not understand. It sounded like a name, or a prayer, or a curse. My limbs froze. I was shaking so badly, I nearly dropped my paddle. The dolls hanging in the tree began to swing more violently. The water around my kayak started to ripple, though there was no wind, no movement. Then the kayak jerked. Something pulled it hard toward the center of the basin. That was it. I snapped. I began screaming, paddling with everything I had. My hands blistered. The kayak scraped the edges of tree roots. I did not care. I fought the current, or whatever force was dragging me, until finally the kayak began to move. Once I hit the mouth of the channel I had come from, the resistance stopped. The water lightened. The screams faded. The insects returned. It was as if the swamp had let me go. I did not stop paddling until I reached my truck. I loaded the kayak with shaking hands and drove away without even wiping the mud off my shoes. That was months ago. I have not gone kayaking since. I do not go near swamps. I barely sleep because something followed me. At night, when it rains, I hear dripping on my windows, but not from the rain. It sounds like something wet crawling across the glass. Sometimes I wake up to hear the faint sound of dolls creaking on strings. Other nights, I hear screams muffled, distant, like someone calling from beneath my floorboards. But the worst is when I hear that gurgled voice again, always from the drain, always whispering something I cannot understand. I think the swamp let me leave, but it did not let me forget. And I do not think it is done with me yet. Her feet made no sound in the water. We shined the flashlight directly at her, and she vanished into the fog. But when we made it back to the truck, she was already there, waiting. I grew up just outside Lafayette, Louisiana, where the Bayou was both a playground and a place you were told to stay out of after dark. My cousin Tyler's family owned an old hunting camp out there. Nothing fancy, just a weathered stilt cabin surrounded by water, trees, and mosquitoes. You could only get there by boat or a crumbling gravel road that barely qualified as a path. This happened when I was 17, the summer before my senior year. Tyler invited me, his friend Jared, and my younger brother Eli to spend the weekend out at the camp. It was supposed to be a chill, no parents kind of trip campfire, beer, stupid ghost stories. But what happened that night is something none of us ever really talk about. Not because we forgot, but because we remember too well. We got there late in the afternoon. It was hot and muggy, and the air felt heavier than usual. Even before the sun dipped low, the trees had already started swallowing the light. The camp looked abandoned. The boards creaked under our feet, and the windows had that foggy film like no one had been inside for years, even though Tyler's dad had used it just a few months prior. We unpacked, ate, and sat out near the water once night fell. The sky was pitch black, no moon, just the sounds of frogs, insects, and the occasional distant splash from something slipping below the surface. I remember the air suddenly went still. No wind, no movement. The bugs even stopped chirping. That is when Jared, in typical Jared fashion, said, "Hey, let's walk the trail behind the camp. I heard there's some voodoo crap out there. Old stones and carvings and stuff." Tyler hesitated, but Eli was already grabbing a flashlight, wanting to prove he was not a kid anymore. I followed. I did not want to seem scared in front of my little brother. That was a mistake. The trail was little more than a deer path, thin and winding, with cypress roots snaking through the mud. Fog had started to creep in, low and heavy, clinging to our legs. You could not see more than 20 feet ahead. Our flashlights cut through the mist like dull blades. Then we heard footsteps, soft, bare, squishing slowly through the muck behind us. We all stopped. I turned around, scanning the trail behind us with my light. Nothing. Tyler whispered, "Probably just a raccoon or something." But it did not sound like a raccoon. It sounded like someone walking. We pushed on, pretending not to be scared. But I was. My stomach felt like it was twisting itself into knots. That is when we saw her. She stood about 30 feet ahead, just barely visible through the mist. A woman, tall, barefoot, long black hair, hanging wet over her shoulders. She wore what looked like a thin, white nightgown, stained and dragging in the mud. Her arms hung loosely at her sides, and she was staring directly at us. No expression, no blinking, just standing completely still. We froze. Jared raised his flashlight and aimed it at her, and in the second the beam hit her face, she vanished. I do not mean she ran. I do not mean she ducked out of view. I mean 1 second she was there, and the next, the space was empty. Nothing. Fog, trees, stillness. Eli whispered, Did you see her eyes?" We ran. None of us said a word on the sprint back to the cabin. By the time we locked ourselves inside, we were drenched in sweat and swamp water. We did not speak for a while. Just sat there in silence, trying to act like we had not seen what we saw. That night was long. We heard soft knocks against the walls. Once we heard footsteps on the porch, bare feet pacing back and forth. But every time we looked outside, there was nothing there. I almost convinced myself it had all been a shared hallucination. Until morning came. We packed up in silence. Everyone just wanted to leave. But when we walked out to the clearing where Tyler's truck was parked, she was there again, standing 10 feet from the driver's door, barefoot in the tall grass, facing us. Same hair, same soaked nightgown, same expressionless stare. I felt my knees lock up. Jared let out a strained, panicked breath. Eli grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. This time, she moved. She turned slowly and walked into the woods, behind the truck, into the thickest part of the swamp. Not running, just vanishing into the trees like she belonged there. We did not chase her. We got in and drove. Tyler went back alone the next week to pick up some of our stuff. He came back pale, saying the cabin door had been wide open, and there were muddy barefoot prints inside. Not one set, multiple, leading from the front door to each of the beds, including the one I slept in. He did not take the trail again. None of us did. I have not returned to that camp since. But sometimes, even now, I feel it. If I wake up and see fog curling outside my bedroom window, or if I step outside and the woods are too still, I remember her, that pale woman in the cypress fog. And sometimes when I am alone, I swear I hear wet footsteps on the porch, bare, slow. I never check anymore, because if she is out there, I do not want her to know I see her. I heard my own voice whispering from behind me, only I had not said a word, and what it whispered was something I had never told anyone in my life. I went hiking in the Atchafalaya Basin last October, a solo trip I planned for months. I had done dozens of solo hikes in rural Louisiana, but the basin was on a different level, hundreds of miles of swamp, bayou, and trails so remote they barely showed up on satellite maps. And that was exactly why I went. I wanted something quiet, isolated, something untouched. My first warning should have been at the gas station right outside the entrance. The old guy working the counter gave me a long stare as I paid for water and snacks. He asked if I was planning to hike the basin. I nodded. That was when he said, without blinking, "Do not step off the trail, not even a foot. You step off, and it sees you." I chuckled awkwardly and asked what he meant by it. He just shook his head and said, "You will not see it, but it will see you." I should have turned around. I know that now. I parked near an old ranger gate where the dirt road ends, threw my pack on, and headed out. The trail was marked barely, but still walkable. The trees were tall and skeletal, draped in moss that hung like curtains. The air was thick and damp. It smelled like wet bark, rot, and something sour I could not identify. For the first 2 hours, it was peaceful. Not a single person, no buildings. Just me and the sound of my boots squelching in the mud and the occasional hoot of a barred owl in the distance. Then the trail narrowed. The brush thickened. My GPS lagged, and when it did update, it showed I was still technically on trail, though no path was visible beneath my feet. I figured it was just an overgrown section. It happens sometimes. About 20 minutes later, I came to a small clearing, a ring of dead trees, as if something had sucked the life right out of them. There were no bugs, no birds, just a silence that felt unnatural, pressing in on my ears like a vacuum. That was when I heard it. A voice, my voice. It came from somewhere behind me, maybe 20 or 30 feet. It said, "This is where you stopped." Same cadence, same inflection. But I had not said anything. I froze. It was not an echo. The voice was too clear, too deliberate. I called out, "Who's there?" but got no answer, just more silence. Then again, "You should not be here?" Still my voice. I spun in circles, trying to spot someone. Maybe a sick joke, maybe a recording. But no one was there. I turned back the way I had come, but the trail was gone. The trees had subtly shifted, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I began to walk briskly, scanning the forest floor for footprints. Nothing. The ground seemed to swallow my steps. I pulled out my phone. No bars, GPS spinning. The temperature suddenly felt colder, though I knew it had not dropped. That was when I heard it again. But this time it was whispering faster. My voice multiplied, saying things I had never said out loud. I should not have followed him. She begged me not to tell. I buried it right under the old tree. Words I had never spoken, but I had thought them years ago. Things I had pushed deep into memory. I do not know how to explain the kind of panic I felt. It was not just fear, it was exposure. It was the feeling of being read like a book. I started running. Branches whipped across my face. Mud splashed my legs. I did not care. I needed out. Then through the trees, I saw it. A figure, no taller than me. Same jacket, same backpack. It was me, standing still, face obscured in shadow. And then it moved. Not walked. Not stepped. Glided closer. Slowly, its mouth opened, too wide, wider than mine ever could, and my voice came out again. "You left her there," I screamed. I tore through the swamp blindly until my legs gave out. I collapsed beside a half-submerged log and laid there for what felt like hours. Eventually, the voices stopped, but the silence was worse. Just when I thought I might fall asleep from exhaustion, I heard something behind me, squelching footsteps. Slow, wet. I did not turn around. I just held my breath. It stopped right at my back. Then, I heard myself say, in a whisper that felt like it came from inside my skull, "You are still off the trail." I blacked out. When I woke up, it was morning. The fog had lifted, and sunlight was breaking through the canopy. Somehow, I found the trail again. No sign of the voices. No figure. Just mud and silence. I walked straight back to the car, not even stopping to drink. Drove until I saw buildings again. That was a year ago. But it did not end there. Sometimes I hear it again, usually at night, when everything is quiet. My own voice, outside my bedroom window, repeating my thoughts. Sometimes, things I had not even thought yet. And always it ends the same way. You are still off the trail. There was no path, no sign of construction, and no mention of it on any map, just a rotting cabin in the middle of the swamp that neither of us had ever seen before. Inside were printed photos of us sleeping, taken from our bedroom windows. My name is Tyler, and what happened to me and my best friend Eric last September still messes with my head every time I try to sleep. We had been exploring the Louisiana Bayou since we were kids, fishing, camping, messing around with boats we built from scrap. We always joked that if we ever went missing in the swamp, it would be because we found something we were not supposed to. Well, last fall, we did. We had been planning this weekend trip for a while, just a couple nights deep in the basin. We wanted to unplug and get away from the noise of life. Eric brought his canoe, and I brought the tent, a few supplies, and my old Nikon. We paddled into the basin for a few hours until we reached a dry patch of land we had camped on before. It was familiar, safe, or so we thought. The first night was uneventful. We cooked over a small fire, listened to the frogs and gators croaking in the distance, and passed out around midnight. We woke early the next morning to that thick swamp humidity and decided to go exploring further east along a narrow, winding water trail. After about 40 minutes of paddling through thick moss and twisted trees, Eric suddenly slowed the canoe and pointed ahead. "What the hell is that?" I looked. Sitting maybe 50 feet inland from the water's edge was a decaying one-room cabin. The kind you would expect to see in a horror movie. Dark wood, sagging roof, one busted-out window. But that was the thing. This cabin was not here yesterday. We were certain. We had paddled right by this spot on the way in, and there had been nothing. No signs of any structure, no wood, no path, no foundation. Just thick brush and trees. Now there was this. Eric pulled us onto a shallow bank, and we climbed out, staring at the building. There were no footprints, no drag marks, nothing around it to suggest someone had recently walked in or out. Yet it looked settled, like it had always been there. We hesitated, but curiosity got the better of us. The door was half open, so we pushed it slowly, the old hinges groaning like they had not moved in years. Inside, the smell hit me first: mold, rot, and something else. Something sour and metallic. The air was cold. Not swamp cool, but refrigerator cold. I remember rubbing my arms as goosebumps crawled up my skin. There was no furniture, except for a splintered table in the middle and a single wooden chair. On the table were several sheets of paper. Eric stepped closer first, then froze. "Tyler," he said quietly, "you need to see this." I walked over, and I swear I stopped breathing for a second. The photos on the table were pictures of me, in my bed, at home. One showed me sleeping, the timestamp reading 3:04 A mother had Eric brushing his teeth in his apartment bathroom. There was one of us together, sitting in his living room, watching TV last week. They were taken from outside the windows, all of them. "These are recent," I whispered. "They're us, man," Eric said. "They've been watching us." I started looking around the room, like someone would jump out of a closet that did not exist. This has to be some kind of sick joke, but who would have done this? We had told no one we were coming out here, and there was no sign of life. No power, no food, not even dust. That is when we heard the creak from the back wall. It was faint, just enough to tell us we were not alone. We bolted, no hesitation. We sprinted out of the cabin, through the mud, nearly flipping the canoe in our panic. The whole paddle back to camp. We did not say a word, just paddled. Hard. The swamp felt quieter than it had before, like everything was holding its breath. When we got back to our campsite, our tent was still there, but something was off. The zipper was half open. Eric's backpack had been moved. My sleeping bag was slightly unrolled, and inside the tent, sitting on my pillow, was another photo. It was Eric and me, from last night. Inside the tent, asleep. That was when I finally snapped. We are leaving, right now. We packed everything up as fast as we could, throwing things in the canoe without thinking. The trip back took twice as long. We kept glancing behind us, sure we were being followed, though we never saw anything. Just the oppressive silence of the swamp. Back on the road, we swore we would never talk about what we saw. Not to friends, not to family. It felt like saying it out loud might make it real, but that was not the end. 2 weeks later, I got a letter. No return address. Just a small envelope with my name, handwritten. Inside was a photo, just one. It showed me, taken from outside my apartment window. I was sitting at my desk, working on my computer. The date was yesterday. Eric got one too. His photo was of him jogging through the park. Same angle, same stalker-like distance. We reported it to the police. They said there was no evidence of trespassing, no fingerprints, nothing they could investigate. That cabin, whatever it was, did not show up on satellite images when we looked. It was gone. But I know what we saw, and I know something saw us too. And every so often, I get another envelope in the mail. No note, no explanation, just another photo. And in every one, I am never looking at the camera, but I feel watched, like I was about to, like I will, very soon.